Our journey today begins on the dark side of the moon, in 1975. Here, beneath a sky of endless blackness, strange structures rise from the lunar surface. Towers, machinery, lights burning against the darkness. Figures move between them. No wind disturbs the dust. No sound carries across the landscape. Only the vast stillness of a world that, according to everything we know, should be lifeless and empty. And yet, someone, somewhere is watching intently, drifting silently above the scene, observing the figures below, watching the machinery at work, and seeing with a level of detail that no human mind was thought to be able to reach. But this watcher is no astronaut. No spacecraft has landed here. No camera is recording these images. Thousands of miles away, on Earth, a man sits quietly with pen and paper. His eyes are closed, and as impressions of what is on the dark side of the moon come to him, he notes them down and sketches what he believes he is discerning. Later, he will send these notes to the man who tasked him to undertake this assignment. The viewer's name is Ingo Swann. By the mid-1970s, Swann has already earned a reputation within one of the most unusual research programs of the Cold War. A program that asked a question many scientists considered impossible. Could the human mind perceive distant places without physically traveling there? And why did the United States government become interested in psychic abilities to the extent that millions of dollars were spent investigating them? Who were the psychic spies? And what were the results of their program? But, returning to our strange lunar observation, something unexpected started to occur. The figures in unison seemed to stop, and then, according to Swann, they looked back. To understand why anyone would ask Ingo Swann to turn his mind towards the moon, we must first return to the Cold War and the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Across the second half of the 20th century, the two superpowers watched one another with relentless intensity. Missiles, satellites, coded messages, spy planes, secret bases. Each side searching for an advantage that might reveal what the other was doing before it was too late. This was, after all, the age of nuclear weapons, an age in which both nations possessed the ability to destroy one another many times over. In a world with stakes this high, even unlikely possibilities become worthy of investigation. And so, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, reports that the Soviet Union was exploring psychic phenomena began attracting serious attention in the West. Telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, psychokinesis, and perhaps, most intriguing of all, the possibility that human consciousness might somehow perceive distant places, hidden objects, or secret information. To many scientists, such claims sounded impossible, but intelligence agencies cannot afford to ignore something simply because it sounds unlikely. If there was even a small chance that a rival power was developing an unconventional capability, then it had to be understood, copied, and beaten. And so, in the early 1970s, American intelligence agencies began funding a small and unusual research effort at the Stanford Research Institute, better known as SRI. Its aim was to investigate the possibility that information could be gathered by the mind alone. It was tasked to see whether consciousness could travel beyond the limits of the physical senses, beyond even time and space, and return with useful information. And its ultimate purpose was to make the very first psychic spy. Among the researchers involved were Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff, two physicists who believed that claims of psychic perception could be studied under controlled conditions. And one of the first and most important figures to enter their work was Ingo Swann. Swann had already attracted attention through earlier psychic experiments, but at SRI, he became more than just a test subject. He helped shape the method itself. What emerged from the program became known as remote viewing. The process, although strange, was taken incredibly seriously and carefully structured. A target would be selected. It might be a location, a building, a person, a military site. The viewer would not be told what it was. all they would receive was an arbitrary set of letters and numbers, a code, something like target XB 168, ZH. From that alone, the viewer would sit quietly, contemplate the target, and begin recording thoughts and impressions through a designated set of steps that Swann helped formulate. Shapes, structures, textures, movement, energetics, all were thought about while considering the target code. The aim was to move past ordinary guessing, away from the prejudgments and the fantasies that the mind was so good at creating. By giving the viewer literally nothing to go on, the belief was that the thinking mind, the ego, would be bypassed and access granted instead to something else. Pure consciousness. At all times, viewers write down the thoughts that come to mind. They submit their notes and are often not even told what their target ever was, or if their notes were useful. To skeptics, the entire process is vulnerable to coincidence, interpretation, suggestion, leakage, and outright fraud. But despite these doubts, the United States government continued to invest millions of dollars over decades into remote viewing research, because the possibility that it might work could not be ignored. And this case was made even more strongly when those involved in the program began producing claims that seemed too coincidental to dismiss. By the mid-1970s, remote viewing had moved beyond simple laboratory experiments into something that was being taken seriously by American intelligence. Indeed, there are examples within the once classified government files that seem to suggest that perhaps the remote viewers really did accomplish the feat of psychic spying. Although not actually involving espionage, one of the earliest and most unusual investigations that helped bring credibility to the work at SRI involved Ingo Swann himself. In 1973, he was asked to attempt a remote viewing session of Jupiter, the largest planet in the solar system. Within his notes, based solely on a target represented by a string of letters and numbers, Swann appeared to describe a ring-like feature surrounding Jupiter. When Voyager 1 discovered faint rings around the planet in 1979, some regarded the session as one of the most remarkable moments in remote viewing history. One of the most frequently cited cases for the SRI program centered on Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, a secret military base in the Soviet nuclear weapons program. Remote viewers were tasked with the target, but what made the sessions credible was the specific level of information they were able to discern. According to later program summaries, one viewer described an airfield, and at one end of that airfield, a large gantry-like crane. This was a very distinctive structure, and that viewer was also able to sketch it. When actual spy planes with imaging equipment managed to picture the base, their images showed a crane, resembling the sketches, and being in the location the remote viewer said it was. And so, this was once again seen as evidence that something more than guesswork might have taken place. In another much-cited case, the SRI remote viewers were asked by the intelligence agencies to assist in locating a Soviet Tu-95 bomber believed to have crashed somewhere in the continent of Africa. They knew it had crashed, but did not know where it was, and were interested in retrieving the wreckage before the Soviets did. The search area was incredibly vast, but with the assistance of remote viewers and their descriptions of the features of the landscape which surrounded the bomber, it is claimed the analysts were able to narrow the target down and provide coordinates which were only a few miles from where it was actually found. Of course, not every session produced results like these. Many failed. Many produced impressions that were vague, contradictory, or impossible to verify. Skeptics argue that coincidence, selective reporting, hindsight, and weaknesses in experimental controls could account for much that appears remarkable. Yet despite those criticisms, the program endured, year after year, and within some circles the program and the viewers began to receive recognition. Perhaps no one as much as Ingo Swann, the originator of the remote viewing method. Yet one of the most unusual assignments connected to Swann did not come from the program at all. It came from outside it, from an individual who presumably had become fascinated by the work carried out at the Stanford Research Institute. a request that would eventually lead Swann to record one of the strangest accounts in the entire history of remote viewing, a journey to the dark side of the moon. Unlike the previous three examples, it must be noted that the account we are about to explore does not come from a government file created by the SRI project. It comes from Ingo Swann himself, and his recount of an experience that happened decades earlier. In 1998, Swann published a book titled Penetration, in which he described a series of extraordinary events that he claimed had taken place in 1975. Swann claimed that in that year he was approached by a mysterious individual who was known only to him by the pseudonym Mr. Axelrod. According to Swann, Axelrod was wealthy, influential, and possessed connections that were never fully explained. If he did exist, his true identity remains unknown even today. According to Swann, Axelrod was fully aware of his work at SRI and questioned him extensively about it. It was this fascination which had led him to task perhaps the most unusual target in Swann's remote viewing career, an in-depth viewing of the surface of the moon. Later retellings of the story suggest that Swann was actually tasked multiple locations on the moon, and as the sessions progressed, he became convinced that at least one of those targets was the hidden dark side of the moon. At first, he reported features that seemed merely unusual, marks resembling tractor treads across the lunar surface, evidence that something had moved there. Then came the structures, towers, domes, bridges, machinery spread across the landscape, artificial lights mounted high above the surface, and in one location, a strange greenish haze lingering within a crater. Then came the figures. According to Swann, they appeared humanoid, moving among the structures as though engaged in work. He later described some as unusually tall and physically impressive, not ghostly apparitions but occupants, individuals apparently carrying out tasks within a functioning environment. The longer the sessions continued, the more uncomfortable Swann became, for the impression he received was not that he was observing ancient ruins, nor an abandoned outpost, but a place that was relatively new, active, occupied, alive. Then something happened that disturbed him more than anything else he had seen. According to Swann, several of the figures appeared to notice his presence and looked straight at him. And the sensation was that they were not just viewing his consciousness on the moon, but the man in the chair. And the feeling became so intense, so profound, so alien, that Swann later described ending the project entirely because of it. According to Swann, months later, when he eventually discussed the experience of all that he had seen with Axelrod, he was struck by how he was not the slightest bit surprised. Swann stated that Axelrod accepted the knowledge with casual familiarity, as if Swann's sessions had simply confirmed or shed additional light on something he already knew. If this is true, then perhaps the most extraordinary part of the story was not what Swann claimed to have perceived, but what was already known, believed, and hidden by the select few. In 1995, the remote viewing program finally came to an end. After more than 2 decades of research, millions of dollars in funding, and thousands of recorded sessions, the United States government concluded that the project had not demonstrated sufficient value to justify continuing it. The psychic spies were stood down, the files were archived, and another strange chapter of the Cold War passed into history. Yet, the story did not end there. Ingo Swann continued writing, teaching, and exploring the ideas that had defined much of his life. He never withdrew the extraordinary claims he made about the moon, and when he died in 2013, he left behind a legacy that remains as controversial as it is fascinating. The government program may have ended, but remote viewing did not. Even today, more than 50 years after the first experiments at SRI, individuals and organizations around the world continue to study, practice, and debate the phenomenon. Some believe the psychic spies uncovered evidence of abilities science is yet to explain. Others remain convinced that coincidence, leakage, and human pattern seeking provide a more convincing answer. As to Swann's moon claims, many point out that Swann knew that the target was the surface of the moon before going into the sessions, and this therefore adds serious questions to the reliability of anything produced. But Perhaps the most interesting thing about the SRI program is not the claims that come from it, but that it existed at all. Whether its work ultimately revealed something extraordinary or was a misguided use of government funds remains a matter of debate. But no matter the answer, it must be acknowledged that the program was real. The scientists were real. The funding was real. The files were real. And the claims of the most profound perceptions of consciousness were taken extremely seriously, even if only for a whisper in time.